Two black twin brothers had only wanted to sit down and eat their lunch. That's it. Nothing more. Nothing less. Just two students, in a high school cafeteria, looking for a quiet corner to rest their minds after a long morning of classes. But in a place where silence meant weakness and identity meant target, even something as simple as sitting at a table could set off a storm. They placed their trays down. Heads down. No arrogance. No challenge. Just hunger. And then it happened. One of the white boys, tall, smug, with that look, the one that carries centuries of inherited entitlement, stepped up, and with a tone so full of poison it could make a room freeze, said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Yo, move. This table's not for your kind." The words didn't just echo. They pierced. Every laugh that followed was a dagger. Students turned. Some chuckled nervously. Some smirked like they'd just watched a comedy show. And some, most, looked away, pretending they didn't see, pretending they didn't hear, because pretending meant they didn't have to choose a side. The twins didn't answer. They looked at each other. There was no fear in their eyes. Just something else. Something quiet. A silence that speaks louder than rage. The second bully, emboldened by the laughter around him, slapped the tray off the table. Food scattered across the floor. A loud clatter. Another roar of laughter. Someone even recorded it on their phone. It was meant to humiliate. To strip dignity. To remind them of where they stood. And yet, they didn't move. Didn't flinch. That was the moment the entire room realized, something was off. Because this wasn't the first time. Not the first insult. Not the first shove. Not the first time they were told to go back where you came from. And yet, it would be the last. What no one in that cafeteria knew, what those two racists couldn't possibly imagine, was that the twins had spent nearly a decade training in martial arts. Every evening. Every weekend. Every bruise and every bead of sweat earned in silence. And not for this. Not for revenge. Not to hurt. But to endure. To discipline. To rise when the world pushed them down. But everyone has a limit. The story that followed didn't unfold in a flash of fists or kicks. It wasn't a chaotic brawl. It was elegance. Control. Precision. The kind of discipline only a true martial artist possesses. In seconds, the balance of power shifted. Not just physically, but emotionally. The audience that once laughed fell into stunned silence. Teachers froze. The phone that had recorded the incident earlier now filmed something else entirely, justice in motion. Dignity reclaimed. But that was just the beginning. Because what started as a cafeteria confrontation would spiral into something much larger. Something no one could have predicted. There would be investigations. There would be consequences. There would be truths revealed that had been hidden for too long. And as the story spread, the twins would become more than just students. They would become a symbol. Not of violence. Not of retaliation. But of strength. Of dignity. Of the refusal to be broken. This wasn't just about a fight. It wasn't even about two boys. It was about generations of silence, of whispers in hallways, of sideways glances in classrooms, of jokes told behind backs, of doors closed quietly so no one would hear the cries. It was about a system that allowed it. Teachers who turned the other way. Administrators who said, "Boys will be boys." It was about finally standing up, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt small, invisible, or not enough. But here's where the story turns. Because the true moment of reckoning wouldn't come in that cafeteria. No. That moment would arrive weeks later, at the school's biggest event of the year, a martial arts exhibition match, set to showcase the talents of the top students. What the crowd didn't know, what even the bullies themselves didn't see coming, was who they'd be facing in the ring. And how, in front of a gymnasium packed with students, teachers, parents, and cameras, the same two boys they humiliated would face them again. Not to fight back, but to show them what real power looks like. The power of self-respect. The power of discipline. The power of standing tall even when the world wants you on your knees. What happened during that match would leave the entire school speechless. The crowd wouldn't believe their eyes. And by the end of it, the ones who once laughed the loudest would be the ones looking away in shame. But the question is, what exactly happened in that final match? What did the twins do that made even the principal question everything? And how did the very same school that once ignored them end up begging for their forgiveness? You'll have to watch until the end, because what comes next will shake you forever. Before we dive into today's powerful story, we want to take a moment to speak directly to every black viewer watching this video. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. Your voice matters. Your experience matters. And your story deserves to be told with dignity, strength, and truth. This channel is a space of respect, empowerment, and justice, and we're proud to share stories that reflect that. Now, get ready for a story that will move you, shake you, and leave you thinking. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We've got more stories that need to be heard. Enjoy the story. Their names were Elijah and Isaiah, born just 7 minutes apart in the middle of a stormy June night in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Identical twins, but not in the ways that most people expected. Elijah, the older by minutes, was the thinker, calm, observant, always reading the room before stepping into it. His eyes held a quiet defiance, the kind that came from years of understanding the weight of the world too early. Isaiah, on the other hand, moved like wind, sharp, direct, impulsive at times, but always with purpose. Together, they were balance. Fire and water. They had grown up in the same house, under the same roof, with the same set of rules and the same dreams, but they absorbed the world differently. And the world, in return, treated them the same way, with doubt, with resistance, with that silent expectation that they'd never go far. Their mother, Denise, worked 2 jobs to keep them enrolled in public school and martial arts lessons. She wasn't rich, but she was relentless. Her rule was simple: never let them define you. Not by your skin, your zip code, or your silence. And so, from the age of 6, the twins began training in a dusty, run-down dojo on the edge of town, where the mats were torn but the discipline was real. Their instructor, a soft-spoken Vietnamese man named Mr. Tran, saw something in them. Not just potential, but purpose. He never allowed them to use their skills outside the mat unless it was to defend, not to destroy. Every strike had to be rooted in control. Every move, in restraint. And over the years, that teaching became their code, not just in fighting, but in life. When Denise was offered a better-paying job in Indiana, she didn't think twice. The boys were just 15. It was a sudden move, and it hit them harder than expected. They left behind everything familiar, their school, their dojo, their friends, and landed in a small, predominantly white town called Clear Ridge, where the streets were clean, the lawns manicured, and the stairs unmistakably cold. The high school was bigger than what they were used to, newer too, with bright banners about inclusion and diversity plastered on the walls. But Elijah could tell right away, those signs were just wallpaper. At Clear Ridge High, everything was about status. Who you knew. What you wore. Where you came from. And it didn't take long for the twins to realize they didn't fit into any of those boxes. Their southern accents, their dark skin, their refusal to blend in, it all painted targets on their backs. But they weren't looking for fights. They kept to themselves, showed up on time, did their work, and avoided the typical high school games. They didn't speak unless spoken to, and even then, they chose their words with care. But for some kids, especially the ones who had never been challenged in their space before, that quiet strength was threatening. Enter Kyle and Mason, the self-proclaimed kings of Clear Ridge. Kyle, the quarterback, tall and golden, with a grin that teachers mistook for charm and classmates mistook for leadership. Mason, his shadow, always a step behind, laughing a little too loud, never thinking for himself. They ruled the hallways with fake smiles and sharp tongues, protected by legacy, sons of donors, grandsons of founders. And they didn't like being ignored. To them, silence from the twins wasn't humility. It was disrespect. And slowly, the tension began to bubble. It started small. Sneers in the hallway. Snide comments during gym. A bumped shoulder here, watch it, there. Nothing big enough to report. Nothing clear enough to prove. And that was the point. It was psychological. Strategic. A war of attrition designed to wear them down. But Elijah and Isaiah had been trained for discipline. Every insult was a test. Every confrontation, a mirror. And they refused to let their anger show. They made few friends. Most students kept their distance, some out of ignorance, others out of fear. But not everyone turned away. There were a few, like Rachel from English class, who always said hello with a softness in her eyes. Or Mr. Donovan, the black history teacher who made sure they knew they weren't alone. But in a school where appearance meant everything, even those small gestures were risky. Kyle and Mason noticed them. And worse, they didn't like them. Then came the talent showcase, a yearly tradition where students could sign up to perform music, poetry, dance, or anything that expressed their identity. The twins, encouraged by Mr. Donovan and Rachel, decided to share something that no one at Clear Ridge had ever seen, a choreographed martial arts performance fused with rhythmic drumming and African movement. It was bold. It was personal. It was them. They rehearsed for weeks. Poured everything they had into it. Not for attention. Not for applause. But to be seen. Truly seen. The sign-up list was public. When Kyle saw their names on it, something shifted. That night, Elijah found the words, "Go back to the jungle," scratched into his locker. Isaiah's practice uniform went missing. And still, they didn't stop. Because they had a message. And they weren't going to let fear erase it. On the day of the showcase, they walked into the cafeteria with their uniforms under their jackets. Heads high. Heart pounding. They weren't naive. They knew the risk. But they had faced worse. And as they moved toward an empty table, the cafeteria went still. That's when Kyle stood up. His tray already half-eaten, his eyes burning with something deeper than hate, something closer to panic. Like a prince watching his throne crumble. And with the whole room watching, he delivered the line that would become the beginning of everything. "Yo, move. This table's not for your kind." The silence was immediate. Every student froze. The air turned thick. And then, laughter. From Mason. From a few kids behind him. Nervous chuckles from others who didn't want to pick a side. Isaiah stood still. Elijah looked down at his tray. For a moment, it seemed like they'd walk away. Like they'd let it go. But something was different this time. Something in Elijah's face. Something in the way Isaiah clenched his jaw but didn't move. Then Mason slapped Elijah's tray from the table. The crash echoed. Food spilled across the floor like spilled dignity. The sound made a few people gasp. Some pulled out their phones. A teacher stood at the far end, too slow to act. And just like that, the moment cracked open. But they didn't react. Not yet. They just looked at each other. And in that look, something passed. Not a plan. Not anger. But permission. The same permission their mother gave them when she said, "Don't ever let them tell you who you are." They didn't swing. They didn't yell. They simply stepped back. Took a breath. Straightened their backs. And then, the tension broke, not with violence, but with stillness so powerful it terrified the ones who thought they had won. What followed wasn't chaos. It was calculated. Controlled. A demonstration, not of power, but of principle. And while everyone in that cafeteria would remember the fight that followed, the real story started long before the first punch. It began with two boys who refused to be broken. Who had spent years training not just their bodies, but their minds. Who knew that real strength wasn't about defeating your enemy, it was about knowing exactly when not to. That cafeteria incident would become the spark. But the fire had only just begun. Because in the shadows of that school, something much deeper was waiting to be exposed. And when it finally surfaced, it wouldn't just change how people saw the twins. It would change how they saw themselves. And it would force even their enemies to face a truth no one was ready for. The cafeteria incident changed everything. Not just the way people looked at Elijah and Isaiah, but the way they looked at themselves. For a long time, they had done everything right, followed the rules, kept their heads down, avoided confrontation, but that moment was a fracture in their carefully built code of restraint. And even though they didn't strike first, the weight of what happened began to ripple through every hallway, every classroom, every whispered conversation behind closed doors. The video spread quickly. Someone had recorded the whole scene, from Kyle's taunt, to Mason's tray slap, to the quiet, deliberate reaction of the twins. It wasn't a full-blown fight, not yet, but the tension was unmistakable, and the silence that followed the recording was louder than anything. The faces in the crowd. The eyes that shifted away. The voices that had once mocked them now unsure of what they'd just witnessed. The footage went up on a local student forum, got reposted on a few social media accounts, and by the next morning, everyone at Clear Ridge High had seen it. But instead of discipline for the bullies, what followed was silence. No announcement. No intervention. No consequences. The administration called the twins into the office, told them it was best to let it go, reminded them that escalating things would only hurt their future. Elijah sat in that chair across from the vice principal, his hands folded tightly, his jaw locked as he listened to someone with a polished tie and hollow concern tell him to swallow the humiliation again. Isaiah didn't say a word. He just stared through the glass window, his fingers twitching, his breath slow and measured like Mr. Tran had taught them. Control. Always control. But this time, it felt different. This time, it felt like control was no longer strength. It was a cage. Outside that office, the whispers grew. Some students praised them quietly, in corners, behind locker doors. "Yo, that was wild," one would say in passing, eyes darting around nervously. "You guys didn't even flinch." Others still mocked them, but softer now, unsure of what retaliation might look like. Kyle and Mason walked through the halls unchanged, smug as ever, surrounded by the same followers, shielded by the same privilege. But deep down, something had shifted in them too. It wasn't fear, it was unease. They had poked the beast and saw it blink. And that was enough to make them angry. In gym class, the tension grew thicker. Coach Harris, a man more concerned with scoreboards than student dynamics, tried to pretend nothing had changed. "Pair up for sparring drills," he said one afternoon, tossing pads on the floor. Elijah and Isaiah, as always, chose each other. Kyle and Mason, as always, chose each other too. But on that day, Coach had a new idea. "Let's mix it up today," he announced, smiling in a way that made Elijah's stomach turn. "Elijah, you take Kyle. Isaiah, you're with Mason." The room fell silent for a second too long. The boys stared at each other, something electric in the air. Kyle smirked as he stepped forward, rolling his shoulders like a boxer about to show off. "You sure you're ready for this?" he muttered under his breath, just low enough for no one else to hear. Elijah didn't answer. He adjusted his stance. Clean. Measured. Mr. Tran's voice echoed in his mind, "Let them come to you. Let their chaos be their weakness." The drill began. It was supposed to be light contact. Controlled. But Kyle didn't follow the rules. He swung too hard. A jab to the ribs. A cheap elbow to the side. The coach turned his back for just a second too long, and Kyle used it to push, to provoke. Elijah kept his composure, kept his balance, kept the control. But Isaiah saw the whole thing. His grip on Mason tightened. Mason, emboldened, muttered something vile, and in a split second, Isaiah dropped him to the mat with a precision move that sent the entire class into shock. Coach blew the whistle. Too aggressive, he barked. You're out. Later that day, in the locker room, Isaiah sat in silence, the tile wall cool against his back. I can't keep pretending this place is neutral, he whispered. Elijah looked at him, his face unreadable. They want us to explode. That's their play, Elijah said. Isaiah shook his head. Then maybe it's time we show them who we are. Rachel found them after school, waiting by the back parking lot. Her eyes were filled with something raw, anger, frustration, concern. Why aren't they being held accountable, she asked. Everyone saw the video. Everyone knows. Elijah gave a tired smile. Knowing and acting are different games. She hesitated. You guys, you should enter the exhibition match. Isaiah raised an eyebrow. You serious? Rachel nodded. It's the school's biggest event. Everyone will be there. Parents. Staff. News even. If you really want people to see who you are, do it where they can't look away. It was bold. It was public. It was risky. But it planted a seed. The martial arts exhibition was a spring tradition at Clear Ridge, part competition, part performance, always a showcase of the school's top physical education students. Kyle and Mason had entered every year, always leaving with a trophy, always hailed as the stars. But this year, for the first time, the roster wasn't locked. The sign-up sheet was open. And Elijah and Isaiah, after long nights of debate, finally added their names to the bottom. Training resumed. Not at a dojo, there wasn't one close by, but in the basement of their house, on makeshift mats, under dim lights and dripping pipes. Denise watched from the stairs, silent, proud, worried. She didn't ask questions. She just made sure they had water, food, space. Mr. Tran sent them old recordings, voice notes, techniques. Don't fight to win. Fight to teach, he said in one message. Let your hands speak truth. Not revenge. The days leading up to the event were heavy with tension. Kyle and Mason laughed loud in the hallways, but their eyes betrayed them. They knew what was coming, even if they didn't understand it yet. Posters went up. The school buzzed with rumors. You think they'll actually fight? You think they'll beat Kyle? Bet they get disqualified. But the twins said nothing. No social media posts. No warnings. Just quiet confidence. Rachel helped them design their routine, a fusion of kata, rhythm, and symbolism. Every move meant something. Every pause held weight. The night before the exhibition, Denise sat with them in the living room. Whatever happens, she said, make sure they remember who they tried to break. Elijah nodded slowly. Isaiah leaned forward, hands clasped. They will. The auditorium was packed. Lights beamed down on the mat. The crowd was loud, buzzing with expectation. Parents in button-downs. Students with phones out. Teachers lined in rows. The principal smiled tight from the front row. The event kicked off with a few standard performances, solid, rehearsed, predictable. Then came Kyle and Mason. They entered with flair, soaking in the applause, performing with aggression and flash. But something was off. A crack in their rhythm. A sense of trying too hard. And when they bowed out, the applause felt polite, not explosive. Then, silence. Then, the twins. They stepped onto the mat, in matching uniforms with no flair, just presence. They didn't bow. They stood still for a long beat. The lights dimmed. The drums started, just a single rhythm, steady, building. And what happened next wasn't a fight. It was art. A message. A movement choreographed with precision and pain. Kicks that spoke of struggle. Blocks that echoed resistance. Footwork that told of exile and return. The crowd didn't cheer, they watched, breathless. Every moment held meaning. Every movement told a story. And then, without warning, the lights flashed bright. A voice over the speakers. An announcement that made every head in the room snap toward the back. Kyle and Mason had requested a last-minute challenge. A live match. Against the twins. Everyone turned. The principal looked uncertain. The coach tried to protest. But the crowd roared. Elijah stepped forward. Isaiah followed. They looked at each other. And nodded. What was about to happen would change everything. The crowd was still buzzing from the performance when the announcement hit the speakers like a thunderclap. A sudden challenge. A live match. 2 against 2. Kyle and Mason, calling out Elijah and Isaiah. The air in the auditorium turned electric, not with excitement, but with something more dangerous, expectation. Some thought it was a joke. Others leaned forward, clutching the edge of their seats, hungry for a spectacle. Teachers exchanged glances. Denise, sitting in the back row, straightened in her seat, her knuckles widening around the program in her hands. Rachel stood near the curtain, breath held, heart pounding. Elijah turned his head slowly toward the direction of the sound, locking eyes with Kyle across the gym floor. Isaiah didn't even blink. The two of them stood in silence for a long moment, not looking at each other, but listening, to the noise, the energy, the pressure. Then Elijah gave the smallest nod, the kind that carried weight. Not approval. Not excitement. Just readiness. They stepped forward in sync, no hesitation, no flair. The crowd began to stir, half in awe, half in disbelief. No one had ever accepted a live challenge during the exhibition. No one had ever needed to. Kyle stood with his arms crossed, chewing on the edge of his mouth, like he was still trying to read the room. Mason bounced beside him, fists clenched, already pumped with adrenaline. They wore confidence like a costume, but up close, that bravado had cracks. Their eyes moved too fast. Their hands twitched too much. They weren't just expecting to win, they were hoping to humiliate. As both teams took their places on the mat, the floor crew quickly adjusted the space, marking boundaries with tape, checking gloves, setting the rules. One of the assistant coaches leaned in and whispered something to the principal, who hesitated but gave a tight nod. It was happening. This was real. The referee called both teams forward, gave the rundown: no striking the face, light contact preferred, respect the tap out. Elijah stared straight ahead, barely hearing the rules. Isaiah bounced on his heels, arms loose, breath even. They had trained for years for discipline, control, structure. But now, they were stepping into something far messier, something raw. Kyle leaned in close, eyes narrow, voice low. Try not to embarrass yourselves too bad. Elijah didn't flinch. He just said, almost too softly, that's your job. The bell rang. It started slow. Measured. Elijah took point against Kyle, while Isaiah squared off with Mason. The first few exchanges were textbook, jabs, counters, movement. Kyle was faster than expected, but predictable. Mason was aggressive, wild, throwing punches that wasted energy. Isaiah danced around him, barely making contact, reading him like an open book. Elijah kept his center, blocking cleanly, redirecting strikes, forcing Kyle to move, to think, to doubt. Then Kyle snapped. He lunged harder, missing his balance, catching a sweep to the ankle that sent him stumbling. The crowd gasped. It wasn't flashy, but it was humiliating. Elijah backed off instantly, giving him space. But the damage was done. Kyle scrambled up, face red, chest heaving. "You think that makes you better than me?" he hissed. "You think any of this changes who you are?" Elijah's voice came calm, clear. "I don't need to be better than you. I just need you to see who I am." Kyle growled and charged again, this time leading with his shoulder. Elijah sidestepped, caught the arm, redirected it into a clean lock, forced him down. Not a slam. Not a knockout. Just control. Pinpoint pressure. Enough to make a point. Kyle grunted, tried to resist, but Elijah leaned in. "Tap," he said. "Or break." There was no anger in his tone. Just truth. Kyle slammed the mat with his palm. The ref called the point. On the other side of the mat, Mason was already breathing heavy, his swing slower, his stance falling apart. Isaiah hadn't touched him yet. Just dodged. Just moved. "You mad?" Isaiah said between breaths. "You thought this would be easy?" Mason lunged again, arms wide, and Isaiah stepped in close, grabbed his wrist, flipped him with one smooth motion. Mason hit the mat flat on his back, eyes wide with shock. The crowd erupted. The ref signaled the point. Kyle stood on the sideline, wiping sweat from his brow, glaring. His chest rose and fell in uneven bursts. Mason pushed himself up, looking around like he didn't know how he got there. For a second, it looked like they might walk off. But then Kyle spat on the mat and stepped back in. "Let's end this." The final round was set. 2-on-2. No holds barred. They met in the center, eyes locked. No more talking. No more games. The bell rang again. What followed wasn't just a fight. It was poetry. Every step, every breath, every movement was layered with meaning. The twins moved as one. A lifetime of shared rhythm and intuition made them untouchable. When Kyle tried to corner Elijah, Isaiah was there with a block. When Mason lunged for Isaiah, Elijah redirected him into his brother's path. The two of them had trained in tight quarters, without mirrors, without coaches, just each other. That bond became a weapon. Kyle lost his footing first, catching a leg sweep that sent him down again. He got up slower this time, his movements sluggish. Mason hesitated, something new. Fear. Real fear. That's when Elijah stepped back. That's when Isaiah lowered his guard. And that's when the real twist landed, not in fists, but in silence. The twins looked at the ref and spoke together. "We forfeit." The room exploded. Confused shouts. Boos. Gasps. The ref blinked. "Are you sure?" Elijah nodded. Isaiah stood tall. "We've already said what we came to say." Kyle and Mason stood frozen, mouths open, chests heaving. They had been handed a win they didn't earn, and somehow, that loss cut deeper than any punch. The crowd didn't applaud for them. They stood. For Elijah. For Isaiah. For dignity. And then, just as the noise reached its peak, Rachel stepped onto the mat, holding her phone high. A video played on the speakers. The one from the cafeteria. Then another. Mason's voice, recorded in the hallway weeks earlier. A racial slur. Laughter. The audio was clear. Raw. Unedited. The audience froze. Teachers paled. The principal stood up. Denise, in the back, wiped a single tear. The truth wasn't just spoken. It was seen. What happened after, changed everything. The video played like a blade slicing through the noise. At first, there was just the crackle of the microphone and the rustle of hallway chatter, but then Mason's voice emerged, loud, clear, unmistakable. A joke, laced with venom, followed by Kyle's laugh and another slur, crueler than the first. Laughter again. The kind that didn't just mock, it erased. The auditorium, which had been vibrating with excitement moments before, went dead silent. No one moved. No one breathed. It was like time had stopped to let the truth echo through every corner of that polished gym. Students looked at each other, wide-eyed and frozen. Parents sat stiff in their seats, unsure whether to gasp or bury their faces. Teachers exchanged horrified glances. And in the middle of it all, Kyle and Mason stood paralyzed, no longer boys with swagger and arrogance, but exposed, two voices now etched in everyone's memory for all the wrong reasons. Rachel didn't flinch. She held her phone high, her face stone cold, refusing to lower her arm until the video ended. Her eyes didn't leave the screen even once. When it stopped, she lowered the device, stepped back, and without a word, joined the crowd. Nobody clapped. Nobody booed. The silence was heavier than judgment, it was awakening. A shift that could not be undone. Elijah didn't look at Kyle. He looked at the crowd. At the rows of students who had laughed, ignored, turned away. At the teachers who claimed to believe in fairness, yet let injustice bloom under their noses. At the principal, whose policies were always wrapped in performative tolerance but whose silence had allowed all of this to rot beneath the surface. The principal took a few steps forward, his face pale, jaw clenched. He opened his mouth to speak, but Elijah beat him to it. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a whisper in a storm. You heard us. You saw us. And you chose nothing. So don't try now. The principal stood frozen, hands half raised, caught between apology and authority. We'll investigate, he started, but Denise's voice rose from the back of the auditorium, strong and unwavering. There's nothing left to investigate. You all knew. You just didn't care until it was public. The crowd turned toward her, but she didn't shrink. Her presence was towering, her gaze unshakable. You had every chance to protect them. To protect any of our children. But you waited for spectacle instead of stepping up for justice. Kyle shifted beside Mason, his lips moving like he wanted to say something, but his voice wouldn't come. His hands trembled slightly. Mason stared at the ground, his entire frame stiff, as if he could hide inside himself. Isaiah watched them with a look that was somewhere between fury and exhaustion. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw. You thought this would make you men. Breaking us. Laughing at us. But real men don't need to tear down others to feel tall. Kyle finally forced out a word, low and defensive. It was a joke. You don't get it, people joke like that all the time. Elijah turned slowly, his face unreadable. You think being laughed at is new for us? You think we haven't heard worse? He stepped closer, not in aggression, but in clarity. It's not about the words. It's about how safe you felt saying them. How protected you were. How sure you were that no one would ever hold you accountable. Mason raised his head, eyes wide. We didn't think it would go this far. Isaiah's jaw tightened. You mean, you didn't think we'd fight back? You never thought we'd outgrow your game? From the side of the room, Coach Harris stepped forward slowly, his brow furrowed, voice low. I didn't know it was this serious, he muttered, like he was talking to himself more than anyone else. Rachel turned to face him, her voice sharp. That's because you didn't want to know. You were too busy watching the scoreboard. The principal tried again, now with a shakier voice. We'll take immediate action. Disciplinary reviews. Counseling. A new equity committee. No, Elijah interrupted, not harshly, but firmly. Not a committee. Not a poster. Not another useless assembly. If you really care, then start by acknowledging the harm. Out loud. Now. The auditorium remained frozen. Kyle's father stood slowly from the back row, a man in a suit who looked like he'd never been challenged in his life. He looked toward the principal, toward Kyle, then at Denise. This doesn't need to be blown out of proportion. Boys make mistakes, Denise didn't let him finish. So do systems. So do schools. So do generations. But not all of us get to make them safely. She stepped into the aisle now, her voice louder. My sons walked into this school with dignity. And they were met with silence when that dignity was spit on. So no, we will not shrink now that the truth is inconvenient for you. The silence broke not with words, but with movement. One by one, students began to rise from their seats. Not all. But enough. Black students. Brown students. White students who had once laughed, now standing with shame on their faces. Some held their phones still recording. Others just stood there, unsure of what to do, but knowing that silence now would be cowardice. Rachel stepped forward again, this time speaking not to the administration, but to everyone. We all saw what they did. But we also saw how they did it. They didn't fight for revenge. They didn't hurt anyone. They showed up. They stood their ground. They told their truth with discipline, with grace. And we let it get this far. The gym began to stir again, this time not with noise, but with weight. The weight of reality. The weight of exposure. And above it all, Elijah stepped to the center of the mat and spoke again, not just for himself, but for every kid who had ever sat at a lunch table and been told they didn't belong. We didn't come here to win a match. We came to be seen. And now that you've seen us, the real question is, what are you going to do about it? No one answered at first. But a single clap broke the stillness. Then another. And another. Until the auditorium was filled not with wild applause, but with something deeper, recognition. Students began to walk down from the bleachers, forming a loose half-circle around the mat. Some were crying. Some were silent. Some simply stood there, eyes locked on the twins as if seeing them for the first time. Kyle stepped back. His hands dropped to his sides. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Mason turned to him, whispering something they had never said before in public. We messed up. Kyle nodded slowly. Elijah watched them. Not with satisfaction. Not with hate. But with truth. This was never about revenge. We just stopped asking for space. We took it. As the twins stepped off the mat, passing by their peers, no one blocked their way. No one whispered. No one laughed. The silence they left behind was no longer the silence of erasure. It was the silence of reckoning. The following morning, the air at Clear Ridge High felt different, not lighter, not cleansed, but cracked open. A silence hung in the halls, not from fear or avoidance, but from the uncomfortable awareness that something had been revealed and couldn't be put back. Posters that once screamed empty messages about unity now looked like hollow declarations taped onto walls that had heard too much and said too little. Students walked slower, eyes less confident, whispers traded for unsure glances. The video had done what no meeting, no assembly, no diversity day ever could. It had forced the school to stare into its own reflection, and it didn't like what it saw. Elijah and Isaiah arrived on campus later than usual. Not because they were avoiding attention, but because they didn't need to walk into it, they already lived inside it. Every step felt loaded. Heads turned. Some nodded with respect, others quickly looked away, unsure of what to say, if they should say anything at all. A few students clapped quietly, but the twins didn't acknowledge it. Their expressions were unreadable, not because they felt victorious, but because they knew this wasn't victory. This was exposure. And exposure, while powerful, was not healing. It was only the start of something they hoped would go deeper, but feared might stay on the surface like so many things did in that school. Inside the administrative building, things had shifted quickly. That morning, Kyle and Mason had been pulled out of class for a closed-door meeting with the school board, the principal, and 2 lawyers. Rumors spread that suspension was on the table, maybe even expulsion. Some students said their parents were threatening to sue the school for allowing the video to be shown. Others whispered that Kyle's dad had tried to pressure the school board into turning the blame toward the twins, suggesting the entire exhibition match was a setup to humiliate his son. The layers of privilege were thick and tangled. Denise, meanwhile, had already contacted a civil rights attorney, not out of vengeance, but to protect her sons from being turned into villains in a narrative they never wrote. But none of that was what weighed on Elijah's mind as he sat quietly near the back of the library that afternoon, staring out the window while Isaiah flipped through his notebook. For all the attention, all the noise, he knew something deeper was happening inside them both, a shift that couldn't be captured in headlines or retweets. The truth was, now that everything was out there, they didn't feel powerful. They felt exposed. Raw. Like they had just survived something that left them standing, but not whole. Isaiah closed his notebook, breaking the silence. Do you think any of it mattered? Elijah turned slightly, eyes unfocused. To them? Maybe. To us? I don't know yet. Rachel appeared at their table a moment later, her face pale but determined. She sat without asking. They're holding a school-wide assembly tomorrow. They're calling it a healing forum. Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. Principal wants to address what happened. Says there'll be a student panel. They want you two on it. Isaiah let out a short laugh, one without joy. So we get to fix what they refused to admit was broken. Rachel looked down, ashamed. They think if you sit on stage and talk about forgiveness, they can walk away clean. Elijah leaned forward, voice low. Then maybe we don't give them what they want. Maybe we give them the truth again. She met his eyes. You're not responsible for educating them, you know. He nodded. I know. But they've heard our silence long enough. Across campus, Kyle sat outside the counselor's office, his leg bouncing restlessly, hands clenched on his knees. Mason was still in the room, being asked to recount his side, how it started, what he thought the school should do next. But Kyle wasn't thinking about that. He was thinking about the moment Elijah let go of his arm in the match. The moment Isaiah backed away instead of striking. That restraint had humiliated him more than any punch ever could. Not because it made him look weak, but because it made him see himself. Not the version he told everyone about, the leader, the athlete, the popular kid. No, it forced him to see the version that mocked, that laughed, that tore others down to feel taller. And worse, it had shown that everyone saw it too, and had for a while. When Mason came out, he looked hollowed. They're offering suspension or public apology, he said quietly. 6 weeks. If we take the apology, they'll reduce it. Kyle stared at him. You gonna do it? Mason didn't answer. He just walked down the hall and disappeared. The next day, the auditorium was filled again, but the mood was nothing like the night of the match. The banners had been taken down. The trophies put away. This wasn't a celebration. This was a reckoning. Teachers lined the walls, quiet. The principal stood at the podium, fidgeting with his notes. He gave a short, shaky statement about the school's values, about learning from each other, about moving forward stronger. No one clapped. Not even the teachers. Then they called the students to the stage. Elijah. Isaiah. Rachel. 2 others from the Black Student Union. And finally, to everyone's shock, Kyle. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Denise sat in the front row, unmoving. Kyle walked slowly, not in his usual confident stride, but with a kind of weight on his back. He took his seat at the far end of the stage, eyes locked on the floor. A moderator handed the mic to Elijah first. He stood up, held it for a long beat before speaking. We didn't ask to be here. We didn't plan any of this to go viral. We didn't perform to prove a point. We just wanted to be seen. And now that you've seen us, we're asking, what do you plan to do with that? He turned to Isaiah, who stood next, voice firmer. We're not asking for apologies. We're not here to clean up your guilt. What we want is change. Real, structural change. Not posters. Not assemblies. Policies. Protection. And proof that our lives matter not just when they're trending, but every day. The moderator looked to Kyle. He took the mic, held it, stared at it for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. I said things I thought were harmless. Because no one ever told me they weren't. Because people laughed. Because no one stopped me. Not even myself. He paused. I didn't lose that match because I got outfought. I lost because I was shown the kind of strength I never had. He looked at the twins. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I am sorry. Not for getting caught. But for being the reason you had to show the world who you are just to be treated like you belong. The auditorium remained quiet, but the silence now was one of reflection. Backstage, before leaving, Isaiah turned to Elijah. You believe him? Elijah didn't answer right away. He looked back at the stage, at the crowd dispersing, at the small group of students forming a circle around Denise, thanking her, crying into her arms. I believe he's starting, he finally said. And that's more than we ever got before. Outside, the sun was setting low behind the school. Rachel caught up with them in the parking lot, her eyes tired but hopeful. There's a protest next week. Students want to march from the school to City Hall. Demanding a new code of conduct. You in? Isaiah smirked. Now that's a match worth showing up for. As they walked off, the school building loomed behind them. Still standing. Still flawed. But for the first time in a long time, not silent. Something had cracked open, and even if it took everything they had to do it, they'd made sure it would never close again. The march wasn't planned by a committee, or organized by the school, or sponsored by any official student body, it came from the ground up. It started with whispers in hallways, messages passed under desks, DMs exchanged late at night by students who had never spoken to each other before but now felt a shared urgency, a mutual ache to do more than just sit in their discomfort. They couldn't unsee what they had seen, and they didn't want to go back to how things were. And so the idea of the march took root like a breath held too long finally being exhaled. What began as a group chat of maybe 20 students ballooned into hundreds. Flyers made with shaky hands and printed in black and white filled lockers and bulletin boards. There were no school logos on the paper, just bold letters that said, Walk with US. The message wasn't rage. It wasn't revenge. It was reckoning. On the morning of the march, Elijah and Isaiah stood in their bedroom in silence. Their uniforms still hung by the closet door, reminders of who they were before and who they still needed to be. Denise came in holding 2 folded t-shirts she had ironed herself. Across the front, printed in simple font, were the words, Strength without hate. She didn't say much, just handed them the shirts, touched each of their shoulders, and whispered, Be proud. But be careful. There was something in her voice that trembled slightly. Not fear. Not doubt. But the quiet knowledge of what it meant for young black boys to walk into public space and demand to be heard. Outside the school, the lawn was filled with bodies. Hundreds of students. Teachers. Parents. Community members. Some held signs. Some wore silence like armor. A group of kids had organized drums and were playing a slow, deliberate rhythm that echoed off the brick walls. The principal was there too, standing off to the side, uncertain whether to take part or observe, but for once not pretending to lead. The superintendent had shown up as well, flanked by 2 district representatives, their eyes scanning the crowd as if trying to gauge how serious this all really was. And at the center of it all were the twins, standing shoulder to shoulder with Rachel and a few other students who had been speaking up from the start. When Elijah stepped forward to address the crowd, his voice didn't shake. He wasn't reading from notes. He didn't need to. This isn't about yesterday. It's not about a video or a match or what went viral. This is about all the days before, when we sat in classrooms and didn't see ourselves, when we were laughed at for speaking truth, when we were told to stay quiet to keep the peace. This march is for those who didn't speak because they thought no one would listen. Today, we walk for them. His eyes scanned the crowd slowly, his voice growing stronger. And if you're here to make it about guilt or blame or image, don't walk. Walk because you believe this place can be better. Walk because you see the cracks and still want to build. Rachel followed, her voice catching in the first few words but growing steadier as she spoke about the silence she'd carried, the shame she felt for not speaking up sooner, for being complicit in her own way by laughing at the wrong times or saying nothing when it mattered most. A teacher from the English department stepped up after her, tears in her eyes as she apologized publicly for watching too many injustices from the safety of her tenure. Even Coach Harris spoke briefly, voice low, saying simply, "You taught me more with your silence than I ever taught you with a whistle." And then, without a signal, the march began. They walked in rows, quiet but unflinching. From the school lawn through the streets of the town. Past the gas stations and strip malls and the quiet neighborhoods where windows slowly opened and people stepped out to watch. Some honked in support. Some stared from porches with crossed arms and tight jaws. Police cruisers followed from a distance, not intervening but watching. There were no chants. No shouting. Just that steady beat of the drums and the collective weight of a truth finally made visible. Isaiah walked near the front, beside Elijah, his eyes scanning everything, every sidewalk, every face, protective by instinct. He whispered to his brother, "Think they'll actually hear us this time?" Elijah didn't look over. "They'll see us. That's a start." Kyle was there too. Walking behind the main group, head low, not flanked by Mason or their usual entourage. Just him. Alone. He didn't carry a sign. Didn't try to speak. Just walked. Each step slow, as if carrying more than his own weight. Some students pointed him out. Others whispered. A few gave him space like he didn't belong. But he kept walking. Not for a show. Not to be praised. Just walking. Because maybe that's all he could do now. As they neared City Hall, the streets thickened with more people. Local reporters showed up, cameras swiveling. City officials stood waiting with nervous faces and pressed suits. The mayor stepped forward, ready with a pre-written statement that tried to thread the line between acknowledgement and deflection. But before he could speak, Denise stepped past the microphone and addressed the crowd herself. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't rehearse. She just looked at the official standing in front of her and said, "My sons should not have had to bleed their dignity into the floor of a gym for you to pay attention. We didn't come here to hear promises. We came here to watch what you do next." A cheer rose, not wild, but solid. Later that night, Elijah sat on the porch, legs stretched out, the cool evening air wrapping around him like a blanket. Isaiah joined him, a bottle of water in one hand, his phone buzzing with messages he wasn't reading. They didn't talk for a while. Just breathed. Eventually, Isaiah said, "They asked me to speak at the next school board meeting. You going?" Elijah nodded slowly. "Yeah. We started something. We should see it through." Isaiah leaned back, staring up at the sky. "Do you think it'll stick? The change?" Elijah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Change doesn't stick. People do. If enough of us hold the line, it'll stay up." Inside, Denise was watching the news. A clip of the march played again, showing the twins walking in silence, surrounded by a sea of students. The anchor called it one of the most powerful youth-led demonstrations the town has seen. The camera panned briefly to Kyle, walking behind them, alone. The anchor didn't mention his name. Rachel sent a voice note later that night, her voice soft. Just wanted to say thank you, for not stopping, for making all of us feel like we had a voice. I hope you know you changed more than just the school. You changed us. Elijah listened to it twice, then deleted it. Not because it didn't matter. But because he already knew. He didn't need to archive the proof. He looked over at Isaiah and asked, "You ready for what comes next?" Isaiah smiled, not wide, but real. Always. The porch light flickered. The wind picked up slightly. Somewhere in the distance, the beat of a lone drum could still be heard, faint, steady, like a heartbeat that refused to quiet down. And the story wasn't over yet. It had been almost 2 weeks since the march, and Clear Ridge High hadn't settled back into its usual rhythm, not because the dust hadn't cleared, but because no one wanted it to. Something had shifted, not just in the building but in the way people moved inside it. The halls were quieter, not with silence, but with awareness. Posters about kindness and tolerance had been quietly removed, replaced with actual notices, new policies in review, student representation meetings, equity training schedules for staff. For the first time, the language of change wasn't performative. It was structural. Tangible. Visible. But even with all of that, for Elijah and Isaiah, something deeper remained unsettled. Because real change wasn't in posters or panels or administrative pivots. It was in hearts. In how people treated one another when no one was watching. And that transformation moved slower. Quietly. Unpredictably. In those 2 weeks, Elijah had spoken at a school board meeting, met with 2 local education advocates, and helped draft a student-led restorative justice proposal with Rachel and several others. Isaiah had taken a more hands-on approach, organizing after-school dialogues between students of different backgrounds, something he called unfiltered talks, no teachers, no adults, just space to speak and space to listen. Every session ended with a moment of silence, where each person was asked to sit with something uncomfortable they had heard. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes students left angry. Sometimes they didn't come back. But it was real. And real was what they needed. The brothers didn't talk much about Kyle. Not because they avoided the subject, but because there wasn't much to say. He had faded from the center of the story, no longer the villain or the focus, just another student figuring out what it meant to be seen differently. After the apology at the assembly, he had stopped showing up to the gym. He left the football team. He didn't hang out with Mason anymore. Most days, he sat by himself at lunch or skipped entirely. And while some students whispered about his fall from grace, others didn't mention him at all. Redemption wasn't guaranteed. It had to be earned, and no one could do that part for him. One afternoon, Elijah found himself back in the gym, alone, standing in the center of the mat, staring at the scuffed floor where so much had changed. The bleachers were empty now. No lights. No crowd. Just quiet. He sat down slowly, legs crossed, hands resting on his knees. Mr. Tran's voice echoed faintly in his memory, the way he used to begin every session, "Stillness reveals the truth your words hide." Elijah hadn't realized how much he missed the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of clarity. He closed his eyes and breathed. The door creaked open. He didn't turn around. The footsteps were slow, hesitant. "I didn't think you'd be here," Kyle said, his voice smaller than it used to be. Elijah stayed still. "Neither did I." Kyle stood by the wall, not daring to step onto the mat. "I've been going through some things. Trying to figure out how to fix what I broke." Elijah finally opened his eyes. "You can't fix it. But you can stop breaking more." Kyle swallowed hard. "I thought maybe I could come to one of those unfiltered talks." Elijah studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You can come. But you don't get to lead. Not yet. I don't want to lead, Kyle said, almost too quickly. I just want to listen. Isaiah entered a few minutes later, catching the tail end of the conversation. He stopped short when he saw Kyle, his jaw tightening instinctively, but he didn't turn around. Instead, he walked to the opposite side of the mat and sat down, mirroring Elijah's position. For a long time, none of them spoke. Just three boys sitting in the quiet, the weight of everything between them hanging in the air. Later that night, Elijah and Isaiah were at home going over their final notes for the school's community town hall scheduled for the weekend. The administration had reluctantly agreed to let students co-lead the event, and the twins had insisted it not be another performance of progress but a real, hard conversation. Denise walked into the room carrying a tray with mugs of tea and set them down gently. She sat at the edge of the couch, her eyes scanning the outlines of her sons, strong, grounded, but clearly worn. You both look tired, she said gently. Isaiah chuckled. We are. Denise smiled softly. Then rest. Not everything has to be carried at once. Elijah leaned back, sipping the tea slowly, his voice lower than usual. I keep thinking about what happens after all this. When the noise dies down. When people move on. Denise reached out and took his hand. You don't do this so people remember your name. You do it so the next kid doesn't have to scream to be heard. Isaiah looked up, eyes heavy. What if the next kid's not strong enough? Denise held both their hands now. Then we keep building something strong enough for them to stand on. At the town hall that weekend, the gym was packed again, but this time with a different kind of energy. Parents, students, staff, local activists, even a few people from the neighboring school districts had come to listen. This wasn't a performance, it was an unveiling. Students shared stories of microaggressions, exclusion, fear. Teachers admitted to blind spots. Some parents cried. Others listened in stunned silence as years of hidden pain were voiced into the open. And through it all, the twins listened, not to respond, not to correct, but to hold space. At one point, an older white man stood up in the back and said, I was raised to think this country gave everyone the same chances. But listening to all this, I see that maybe I wasn't seeing it all. He looked directly at Elijah. Thank you for teaching me something I didn't even know I needed to learn. After the event, as people slowly filtered out, a young black student approached Isaiah, maybe in middle school, his voice barely above a whisper. I want to be like you someday. Isaiah crouched to his level and smiled. You'll be better. You'll start where we had to fight to stand. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the gym emptied out, Elijah and Isaiah sat on the edge of the mat, side by side, watching the light fade through the windows. They didn't speak at first, just sat in the quiet, letting the weight of the day settle. Finally, Elijah broke the silence. You feel it? Like maybe it's starting to shift. Isaiah nodded slowly. Yeah. Like the ground's not moving under us anymore. There was still so much left to do. So many policies to rewrite. So many minds to reach. But for the first time, it didn't feel like screaming into a void. It felt like building something that could last. And maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone anymore. Months passed. Not quickly, not easily, but with the slow, determined rhythm of real change. Clear Ridge High began to shift in ways no one had expected. The new code of conduct passed unanimously at the district level. It redefined how racism, bullying, and bias would be reported, processed, and addressed. A restorative justice program, once a whispered dream, was now built into the curriculum, with trained student facilitators leading monthly dialogues. Every staff member, from the janitor to the superintendent, completed mandatory equity training, but more than that, the culture itself began to evolve. Clubs that once operated in silence were now central voices in school life. Stories that once stayed buried in group chats or corners of lunch tables were now spoken in open forums with support behind them. The halls weren't perfect, but they were no longer silent. Elijah was offered a seat on the district's Youth Advisory Council, where his voice began influencing policies far beyond the walls of his school. He balanced that with honors classes, college prep, and his work mentoring younger students who were now looking to him as a guide. Isaiah, always the heartbeat behind the movement, started a campus initiative that paired upperclassmen with new students from marginalized backgrounds, helping them navigate the school system not just academically, but emotionally. The program became so successful that it gained recognition from a statewide youth leadership foundation, earning him an unexpected scholarship. What had started as self-defense became community defense. What was once survival became influence. Rachel's path changed too. Her quiet strength transformed into vocal advocacy. She joined a journalism program where she focused on race and education in small-town America. Her articles were picked up by local media, eventually gaining traction with national platforms that wanted to hear the voices she amplified. She and Elijah remained close, connected not by romance, but by respect, by the bond forged through truth-telling and standing side by side in fire. Kyle, for a while, disappeared from the spotlight. His apology had not erased the pain he caused, and he didn't expect it to. Instead, he did something few expected. He showed up, consistently, to the hard spaces. He attended every unfiltered talk. He never spoke unless asked. He volunteered behind the scenes at town events. He met with counselors. He took accountability, not just in words, but in the daily, uncomfortable grind of growth. Over time, some people softened. Others didn't. But Kyle didn't ask to be seen. He asked to be better. And that was a beginning. Mason transferred out before the end of the semester. Rumor was his parents didn't want him in an environment where he was constantly vilified. But no one missed the energy he brought. Sometimes absence is a form of healing too. Denise, steady, brilliant, relentless Denise, became more than a mother watching from the sidelines. She accepted an offer to sit on the Parent Equity Committee, then eventually co-chaired it. Her voice became a vital bridge between the administration and the community, ensuring no other mother would be told to wait until it was too late. Her sons weren't just her pride, they were her proof. The day Elijah and Isaiah stood on stage at graduation, the auditorium erupted in applause long before their names were even called. Their classmates had voted them co-speakers for the senior farewell, and when they took the mic together, it wasn't just a speech. It was a promise. They spoke not about themselves, but about the classmates who stood up when it mattered, the ones who listened, who changed, who dared to face their own silence. They spoke about how strength doesn't have to roar to be heard, and how healing, though slow, begins the moment someone chooses to stay in the room. As they exited the stage, someone had placed a banner above the doors that read, "We walk because they stood." Neither brother knew who had written it. But they didn't need to. The final summer before college was quiet. Peaceful in the way that only follows a storm. Elijah received early acceptance into a top university with a full-ride scholarship in political science. Isaiah would be studying social work in a state school nearby. Their paths were diverging but aligned. They promised each other they'd keep building wherever they landed, because the fight wasn't over. It had simply begun. The community held a send-off barbecue for them in the park, and as the sun dipped behind the trees, Denise stood up to speak. She didn't cry. She didn't boast. She just looked at her boys and said, "You turned pain into power. And you gave it away without losing yourselves. That's legacy." So what do we take from this? Maybe this story wasn't just about two brothers. Maybe it was about all of us. About the moments we're forced to choose who we are, not with words but with action. About how silence can either be complicity or resistance, depending on what we do with it. And maybe, just maybe, it's about how real strength isn't found in fists or matches or crowds, but in staying. In standing. In speaking, even when your voice shakes. So, now we turn to you. Have you ever been silent when you should have spoken? Have you ever been the one who watched instead of stood up? What will you do next time? Let us know in the comments below. Your story matters too. And if this story moved you, inspired you, or made you see something new, make sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist and leave a like. We've got more stories that'll make you feel, think, and maybe even act. Until next time, keep standing. Keep building. Keep walking.